What about government push towards forcing decarbonization, forcing me to consume low-carbon hydrogen?
Federal clients and customers are really interested in geothermal. There's quite a buzz around it right now.
If I was a player in the wind world, I would be looking at that 18 to 24 month time frame for delivery pretty conservatively. It's kind of crazy.
Hello, and welcome to Interchange Recharged, where we break down the latest in clean tech, energy policy, and climate finance. You might be wondering who this new voice is that you're hearing. I'm Bridget Van Dorsten. I'm an analyst at Wood Mackenzie, where I research and analyze global energy markets just like Sylvia does. And speaking of our wonderful and regular host, Sylvia, she will be off on maternity leave for the next few months, so I will be keeping the mic warm for her. Today's show will reflect back on some of the best conversations that we have had this year, and you might have missed some, so I selected a few of my favorite discussions to kick off my time as host. Perhaps a bit more about me. Similarly to how Sylvia is a solar-focused analyst, I do research as well, but my focus is on hydrogen. And although I am an engineer, I have somehow devoted my career thus far to researching a molecule that is frustratingly inefficient to make and expensive to move around. Yet I do find it quite fascinating to cover something that's so new and little known. The upside for you all is that it gives me an earnest perspective on the energy transition. And so over the next few months, alongside all of you, I want to dig into the technologies and the policies and the business models that are actually moving the energy transition forward, and not just the ones that are getting the most hype. So whether you find yourself in industry or just trying to understand how we're going to achieve carbon emission reductions, please stick around. I will bring the questions and hopefully we will uncover some interesting answers together. As I mentioned, today's episode will now look back upon some of my favorite conversations from earlier this year that you might have missed. And you can think of it kind of like a highlight reel before we dive into the deep end together in the new year. Now, a few years ago, oil and gas majors were making bold moves into renewables, scaling back investments in new oil exploration, and rebranding their operations. But in February of this year, BP announced that it was cutting its renewable energy investments and increasing oil and gas production. Now, under investor pressure and alongside its rivals like Shell and Equinor also reducing their investment in renewables, BP said it was going to now increase investments in oil and gas. And as we're recording this episode, COP30 has just wrapped up with grim forecasts to climate change as the world really tears past this 1.5 degree warming target. But climate science hasn't changed, so why are companies resetting their renewable strategies? And it's even that some of the very companies that led the charge on phasing out fossil fuels are now pulling back and reassessing whether renewables can deliver the returns that their shareholders demand. At the same time, we see gas playing a larger role in portfolios, and the energy demands of the tech sector are shifting the conversation yet again. So what's really going on strategy-wise? In a moment, you'll hear from Ben Dell, managing partner at Chemerich, and Tom Ellicott, senior vice president at Wood Mackenzie, to hear where they think the renewables market has gone wrong and what the fallout will be from oil and gas majors stepping away from climate action.
One of the positives we've seen emerge over the last few years is strategies that sort of have become more diverse, and I think that's a good thing. You know, we're not just talking about renewable power now. We're talking about sort of how to supply low carbon gas to power stations, how to decarbonize power stations, difficult to decarbonize sectors using CCUS, etc. There are some lessons that can be learned from the early expansion into low carbon. Probably not a great surprise. You know, it's still sort of some of these technologies are still quite embryonic. If you move too quickly and set very ambitious targets, that sort of maybe puts more pressure to do M&A, possibly acquiring more mature assets where you have to pay a bit of a premium. And I think that's been one of the factors which has weighed on some of these companies that have had to dial back. What's interesting, actually, looking at the difference for the Euro majors is really the pace of either what's been happening in the upstream sector. So when BP embarked on its low carbon strategy, it announced a target to reduce its oil and gas production by 40% this decade. Total Energies, in contrast, had this dual growth strategy. So growing in integrated power, but also growing in oil and gas with a big focus on LNG. And I think that has been sort of a very important success factor for Total Energies, the fact that they've been continuing to be very active in the oil and gas sector, building their oil and gas portfolio. And actually, when you look at the numbers, they've got some of the best growth in oil and gas of all of the companies. So that question around pace, an important one. One of the other things I think I would say is you need those strategies to be flexible. You need to adapt them and adjust them, because this is evolving in all sorts of ways we would never have predicted. We always knew it was going to be a bumpy road. Probably didn't realize it would be quite as bumpy as this, but that means you need strategic optionality. You don't sort of necessarily want to close down any options. So I think building portfolio optionality is, again, quite an important success factor as we look ahead, just because of all the uncertainty on the horizon.
Yeah, I was actually wondering if Tom was going to bring up Shell. I mean, I think Shell's investment in LNG, which was really a pioneer and has been one of the with the British BG transaction going back nearly a decade, Shell built a dominant position in the LNG and the gas trading space, which I think in the last 4 or 5 years has paid huge dividends for Shell. So I think that's a slightly different approach to where someone like Total has approached the space. From our side, I mean, we're building an integrated, gas wellhead to water player with our Eagleford gas operations through Commonwealth LNG. We talk about building the British gas of the US. So we're a big believer in integration. We're a big believer in gas. We're a big believer in the value creation around that integrated asset, potentially all the way through to power. So I think, Total have obviously been in this space. I would say my personal view is Shell have been one of the leaders in this space as well. But I think you're seeing more and more players enter the integrated gas space. Whether or not you define that as transition or how you separate those economics, it is a high returning piece of business.
Here we've identified a key reality, which is that the energy transition is happening slower than expected, which becomes quite relevant as we explore hydrogen, geothermal, and wind later in this episode. But oil majors hold a unique position in the energy transition, and despite their fossil fuel focus, their scale is really what provides this outsized influence. They have massive balance sheets and stakeholder networks that smaller players just can't match. And as Tom mentioned, Total Energies exemplifies this quite well, investing that $20 billion in low carbon initiatives while also expanding their oil and gas operations. And this financial flexibility is really crucial where renewable companies or other developers struggle with debt financing constraints. Majors actually have the optionality here to provide direct balance sheet funding. But this advantage is a double-edged sword. While they have capital, they also answer to investors who view energy transition projects as high cost, high risk ventures with uncertain returns. And when investors push back on risky investments, like we saw with Air Products earlier this year in the hydrogen market, companies listen. And Tom's bumpy road reference reflects this tension that we see between climate urgency and business pragmatism. Majors maintain the strategic optionality, which is keeping multiple pathways open rather than fully committing to any approach, which reveals this transition timeline complexity that we have. And the strategic optionality becomes particularly evident when we examine the hydrogen sector, which is an area where oil majors are both significant consumers and producers of hydrogen. So let's move on to hydrogen, the next topic of today, which is a sector promising transformation, but grappling with really fundamental challenges around cost and policy and demand. Earlier this year, Sylvia spoke with Carl Cho from Citibank and myself about the sector's outlook, given weak demand materialization due to poor regulatory policy and relatively high costs.
There's already a strong, demand for conventional hydrogen, for gray hydrogen. And I think it's just a matter of willingness to pay the green premium. green. It's stronger in some markets and not as developed in others. And I think it depends on downstream application of that green hydrogen for, as Bridget hinted at, for mobility, perhaps in combustion, blending with natural gas, right, for electric generation, those kind of use cases. And I think the economics of those they're pretty competitive. I think it's difficult to get your arms around paying a green premium unless there's a mandatory reason to, or there's another compelling economic reason to make that happen.
What is a premium? I know that it varies depending on the region, but do you have like an order of magnitude of how much the premium represents?
Yeah, I was going to say not only does it vary based on the region, but it also depends on what end use sector you're talking about for hydrogen. So if hydrogen is going to displace natural gas, then the natural gas cost is going to be the parity that hydrogen needs to meet. So if we're talking about Henry Hub pricing and, you've been able to achieve $2 per kilogram, you multiply that by roughly 7.5 to get a MMBTU cost, and now you're talking about $15 per MMBTU, which is quite a stark difference from what Henry Hub is. And then if you're talking about in Europe, if you're able to achieve that, $2 2 euro kilogram per kilogram price, now 15 euro per MMBTU equivalent looks more comparable. But that's all prefaced by, oh, and by the way, we're nowhere near $2 per kilogram. We're nowhere near 2 euros per kilogram. So then what does that premium need to be? Well, it needs to be, an insane carbon tax in the hundreds of dollars. What I was going to add and complement what Carl said about the mandatory, unless you're forced to consume hydrogen, that's exactly right. And I would say that buyer uncertainty comes from cost, but regulatory uncertainty doesn't help either. And one of the things that we've seen progress very slowly in the hydrogen market has been policy, subsidizing production. Fine, great, thank you. But what about government push towards forcing decarbonization, forcing me to consume low carbon hydrogen? And that's what has been really missing. And the only policy that we've really seen legislated, especially in Europe, is the Renewable Energy Directive. So the RED III initiative that is now saying, okay, for the carbon intensive hydrogen that is being consumed in industry domestically in Europe, now 2.3 million tons per annum of that is going to need to be low carbon hydrogen by 2030. And in addition, we're going to need to have 0.62 million tons per annum of low carbon hydrogen for transportation by 2030, which is 5 years from now, which is very promising, and that directive will stimulate this RFMBO compliant hydrogen. I briefly mentioned that earlier in the podcast, but essentially that means green hydrogen for now, unless they change what it means. But even then, those 3 million tons per annum by 2030 of foreseeable demand in Europe, Wood Mac doesn't believe that that's even going to be achievable, because we're not going to be able to see producers and off-takers react quickly enough, because even at this point, those RED III directives have until May in order to be transposed into member state legislation. And finally, then, will both producers and off-takers have an understanding of what the penalty would be for them not to meet those targets. At that point, they can then do the economic analysis of, here's the trade-off, here's what the green premium is, here's, I either pay this penalty or I pay for green hydrogen.
Are there any other major policies? Bridget did touch on the EU, but is there anything else happening in the world that is driving these, would it be fair to say forcing or increasing the interest of potential off-takers in green hydrogen?
Over the past 4 years, we've been tracking all of these roadmaps, targets, objectives that country strategies they're putting forth on hydrogen, and almost anyone and anybody can put together a roadmap or a strategy. But There's very little that's incentivizing the demand side of things. I would say RED 3 is going to be like the star-studded cast member that's really shows whether or not this legislated target works. And then also playing a role further down the road as you start to see carbon border adjustment mechanisms and carbon costs start to increase. At the very beginning, it's going to be pretty much negligible for hydrogen because, like I said, you need such a high carbon cost in order to reach that cost parity. But, in the mid 2030s, that's when you can really start seeing the slow ramp of carbon border adjustment mechanism, the costs increasing and bringing hydrogen a little bit closer to parity.
So, 9 months ago, we identified the problems plaguing the hydrogen industry. And if you haven't been paying attention to hydrogen since then, don't worry. Those same big three headaches we talked about, which were cost, policy, and offtake, are still very much the main pain points of the sector. But I'll give you an update since then, and we'll start with the latest in the US. ExxonMobil has just delayed its $6.1 billion Baytown hydrogen facility. And I want to point out that this was not some kind of speculative startup project, but it was a technically sound facility backed by two energy majors with actual offtake agreements lined up, planned to capture the 45V tax credit. Now, keeping attention on the US market, the One Big Beautiful Bill shortened this timeline to qualify for the 45V hydrogen production tax credit, which, if you don't know, would award about $3 per kilogram to any molecule, which is quite a hefty tax credit. And whilst this doesn't directly affect Baytown's timeline, it does undermine the broader U.S. market development, making only a handful of U.S. projects able to meet the timelines at best. And on top of that, the Trump administration also terminated over $2.7 billion in hydrogen funding across more than 50 projects, including 2 regional hydrogen hubs, as well as manufacturing grants to electrolyzer companies. In short, the Trump administration has demonstrated a complete federal withdrawal from any kind of hydrogen development support in the US. And there's another hot topic involving the US, which is the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, has delayed adoption of its net zero framework by 1 year following pretty intense lobbying by the US and Saudi Arabia, which now leaves the maritime hydrogen industry in limbo and undermines a key demand driver for hydrogen derivatives in the short term and long term. Meanwhile, in Europe, I spoke about Europe quite a bit in the outtake, but there was a bit of an exodus from one of the biggest funding mechanisms, the European Hydrogen Bank auctions earlier this year, where about 7 of the 15 winning projects, representing roughly 80% of the capacity that was allocated, funding from the second round, essentially said thank you, but no thank you, and withdrew their projects. Why did they do this? Well, that's because the structure of the funding award had the projects bidding so aggressively to win the funding that they couldn't actually deliver at those prices when they proceeded with their engineering studies. I mentioned RED 3 quite a bit in the quoted segment, stating that May this year would be the turning point for understanding penalties for non-compliance with RED 3. But now, more than 6 months later, many member states of the EU are delayed in transposing the legislation, and we still don't have a clear picture, and they don't have any penalties for being delayed. Now, before you think Bridget's total doom and gloom, there actually is some good news. And I want to point out that over the past few years, more than 6 million tons per annum of low-carbon hydrogen projects are under construction or operational. What is 6 MTPA, million tons per annum? Well, that's about 6% of the world's current carbon-intensive hydrogen consumption. So we're off to a pretty good start. And here's the thing. Almost all of these successful FIDs, or final investment decisions, have something in common. They're either refineries decarbonizing their own hydrogen demand, or they have rock-solid, long-term offtake agreements in place before breaking ground. The speculative build-it-and-they-will-come projects are the ones that are getting canceled and delayed. And they are, as we've heard in the market over the past year. But effective policy can make a difference. Like RED 3 is driving genuine demand with refiners like Repsol and Total Energies, where they have confirmed that green hydrogen is their most competitive route to regulatory compliance. So where does this leave us? With the hydrogen industry in late 2025 It looks a lot like it did in early 2025, I would say, just with fewer illusions. Now, that's hydrogen, but what about another nascent technology that's struggling in the current US policy environment? Geothermal. And in July, Sylvia spoke with John Plack, an engineer who has led the technical execution of more than $2 billion in clean energy projects across 25 years. Now, here's what they said about the policy support for geothermal energy right when OB3 was signed into law.
Other aspect that has been affecting the renewables industry as a whole is what we're calling this much more restrictive policy environment. So is this affecting geothermal in any way, like either on the development side, implementation, and is that being an issue compared to the optimism that we saw, let's say, in 2024?
Geothermal is one of those areas where we fared a bit better than the other sustainable technologies that are out there right now. And we still see in the IRA incentives around geothermal. We still see the DOE supporting these, earth shots, so that all of these things are still lined up to allow geothermal continued growth. So I would say that this technology has been a bit more resilient than, unfortunately, some of the other ones that have not weathered as well. Which, for those of us that are interested in this technology continuing to expand has been a good thing. And I always look at all the new press briefs that come out, or when something comes out from the government, I'm reading it right away and really zooming in on geothermal right away. So
yeah.
But yeah, we've fared quite a bit better than some of the other technologies for sure.
Yes, I think in the at the moment of this recording, there is a budget reconciliation discussion ongoing. So the Senate's still reviewing the draft of the bill. But overall, it seems that geothermal is pretty much on the safe side compared to other technologies like wind and solar that have been more affected, that it seems that the tax credits would be expiring earlier. But geothermal, carbon capture also seem to be pretty well positioned. So that gives a sense of how this industry is perceived by the the current administration on both sides of the aisle. So I think it's a good time to be in this industry right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think, we circle back to the previous conversation we just had on the benefits from both political parties.
Yeah.
We can lean on either side of that, equation to be able to continue to weather the political environments. And from a short-term perspective, that's good news for geothermal. We'll have to hope that continues from a long-term perspective, from the greater than 5-year perspective, because there is hopefully some real good growth coming in this industry, and continued support from the government is going to be critical to seeing that go.
How are you seeing support, not necessarily on the policy side, but on the off-taker side? Like, how much interest is there on geothermal? And also, how varied are the off-taker types? Like, are you seeing more corporate interested, more utilities, a mix of both? How's that going?
My personal perspective is shaded by my day-to-day, job, so to speak. So I focus a lot on the federal and our utility business.
Okay.
Our federal clients and customers are really interested in geothermal. There's quite a buzz around it right now, and really built around the resiliency of the technology, so that it is 24/7. Two, that it's domestic. It can be in their backyard. They can do it on their grounds right now.
Compared to depending on gas or oil or anything that requires any imports. Is that
exactly? Okay. Or storage of the asset to be able to, weather an outage, where this is right in their backyard, so to speak, and they can continue to produce 24/7. They don't have to worry about trucking in, like you're saying, or the logistics around the utility. So yeah, there is a very keen interest on that side. On the utility side, not so much yet. But I think, once we get through this, as you indicated earlier, some of the budget cycle that we're in right now and waiting on a final bill to really be passed, I think once we see that, we're going to see some folks be able to set policy and what they want to see over the next couple of years that's, in line with what the industry is going to be able to provide and support. So we haven't seen it yet as much on the utility side. I think if we're able to scale up for our commercial customers or our federal customers and get into this technology, it will be easily adopted from them. They have the desire. When you look at some of the natural disasters that have occurred and folks not really feeling in control of the utility aspect of their operations, this can provide some of that. So, these deployed generating assets, whether it's geothermal or anything else you're doing, is really a benefit. So selling that side of it, the resilient side of it, is going to be really key. And yeah, we are seeing a lot of interest on that end.
Now, although hydrogen got thrown to the dogs, geothermal was actually one of the few renewables favored in the One Big Beautiful Bill, meaning that its tax credits remained. And we'll definitely come back to geothermal in the new year, considering Fervo Energy's Utah plant is scheduled to begin operations and has an off-taker in place. But it'll be interesting to see whether the 500 megawatt plant is ready when it says it will be. And it'll help answer the question, is geothermal finally ready to move from the pilot stage to commercial scale deployment? But for the last topic of today's episode, we'll focus on wind energy. Now, that's a sector that has definitely fallen out of favor with the current US administration, and Trump himself has been a longtime critic of wind energy despite its efficiency and cost benefits. We saw installation activity in the sector kind of tumble in the first half of this year with about a 60% drop year on year. And even later in the year, right about now, offshore wind is still under significant strain, with major developers canceling projects amidst permitting uncertainty. And it was interesting for us to get the analyst's view on wind, as we did back when Sylvia spoke with my former colleague, Stephen Maldonado, back in May. And here's what they were forecasting for the wind sector earlier this year.
So, Stephen, if you had to summarize in a word what is happening in the wind sector at this moment, what would that be?
I feel like unpredictable is a soft way of putting it. A roller coaster. How about that?
Yeah. Hey, I think you're copying the solar one. We have solar coaster on the solar side.
Okay.
There has been a lot of back and forth on the policy side. Overall, there is a lot of uncertainty. It has been very unpredictable. A couple of days ago, the House just passed the new budget reconciliation bill, and there are a lot of opinions about it, but I guess the vast majority of people think that this is a big hit for the renewables industry and particularly for wind. So could you share with us some of your first thoughts about what this new bill means for the sector?
So I think you're totally right. I haven't heard from a single person that says that this bill is a good thing. FEOC.
Foreign entities of concern?
Yes, the FEOC, foreign entities of concern. The way that that's spelled out in the current language of the bill is unworkable. And from what I understand, really disqualifies any project from gaining access to tax credits.
Sorry, just to elaborate on that, why is that? Why is it so difficult for a company to not be involved with a foreign entity of concern?
The reality is that there's so many different components inside a wind turbine, so many of them that are specially made for a wind turbine. And so many of those, whether they're small electrical components, drivetrain components, nuts and bolts in equipment that is holding some other equipment. There's so many of these little things that something has to come directly from China. And if that is the way that the bill is written, then that would disqualify these projects from getting tax credits.
And that's on the project side, right? Because my understanding is that you have a project level definition of the involvement of a FEOC, and then you also have the participant percentage. I'm not sure about the exact term, but if a developer, let's say, has some participation from a Chinese entity up to a certain percentage, I need to check this one out, then the project would not qualify either, even if they're not using equipment from a foreign entity of concern. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. So even if you get to the top of the mountain of somehow sourcing a wind turbine 100% with stuff that is not made in China, yeah, my understanding, and I'm not an attorney, so just clarifying that, but that, yeah, it goes beyond that to the developer or to project financiers, that if there is, I think the term is influenced entity or something like that, through the complicated nature of ownership structures, investment structures, on top of the supply chain, it's so interconnected that at some point it gets back to China.
On the solar side, some discussions that we've been having with other players is that, well, maybe you're not getting the module itself directly from China, which has been historically been the case over the past few years. The problem is that things that the IP items that you were mentioning, like the nut or the bolt that is in the inverter or some other component, that can actually come from China. So it becomes very tricky for a developer to figure out their procurement strategy, because now, I think it's very difficult overall to have full traceability on where a specific nut or bolt is coming from, right?
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about the overall policy environment, one of the ways that I'm framing it is that you have, maybe if you think about it as like the legal implications of some policy, right? And that, as we're just talking about right now, it's in flux. There's ambiguities, things are unclear. And so we don't know that aspect of the direct, if you want to say it that way, the direct aspect of that policy. But the variability and that ambiguity and that uncertainty and all this stuff that's changing from day to day, at the time that we're recording this, I am just coming back from the American Clean Power Conference in Phoenix. And literally over the course of my flight, the notes and presentations that were given during the conference all is outdated. And so that kind of uncertainty and up and down, that itself is an effect.
Yes.
Through Q1, we saw that, this volatility of tariffs and just even the uncertainty of whether a bill like this would have been introduced in the first place, it tanked announced turbine order intake. Almost nothing was procured in Q1.
Oh,
and
wow.
so I think that sort of that policy uncertainty, we're seeing a squeeze from both ends. So on the front end right now, it's this uncertainty that's prohibiting project procurement. It's slowing down the development process. It's delaying individual projects and the overall development landscape. And then the policy itself, again, on the direct language of the policy, right, where we're talking now, in order to get tax credits, it has to be in service by 2028. On one end, it's that uncertainty, and on the other side of things, the language of being in service by the end of 2028 is now creating this super, super tight window. It's going to be really tricky for a developer to find enough certainty to make an investment decision between now and the end of the year with the hopes of, placing a turbine order, starting construction, all of that by the end of 2028. It's really that kind of like double end squeeze.
I was going to ask about that because, as you mentioned, there is this very tight time frame to start construction. So the FEOC definition would only apply to any assets that start construction. I think it's 2 months, either 2 months after the bill is passed or before the end of the year. That is a time frame that has been mentioned so far. So realistically, an asset would need to start construction over this time frame, but it would also need to be completely finished by the end of 2028. How realistic is that for a wind project?
It's a good question. Right now, a ballpark that our team works with is that from the time of announcement to turbine delivery is usually between 18 and 24 months. That's a pretty tight window to begin with. And understanding some of the, other stuff that's going on right now in the wind world, right? We currently have SunZia, one of the biggest, I think the biggest project in the Western Hemisphere, 3.5 gigawatts that's under construction right now. And Vestas and GE are supplying turbines to that project. And so when you think about from a perspective of cranes, there's only so many cranes out there that can do, construction for these really tall turbines at any one point in time. I have to imagine that if some of these resources are being allocated to these mega projects and, some of that outlook is already accounted for, there's always construction delays, whether it's too windy to bring a component or bring workers up to the top of a turbine. That kind of stuff delays construction. So again, if things are so uncertain right now and it's a tight window to begin with, if I was a player in the wind world, I would be looking at that 18 to 24 month time frame for delivery pretty conservatively. I don't think there would be enough confidence to bank on the front end of that.
What are developers doing? Like, is there a way to, like, how do you navigate all this uncertainty? Can you sign a project? are you even willing to place a turbine order now? What are the reactions that you're seeing from the market?
It's kind of crazy. I feel like, I've heard a couple perspectives of one, just put your head down, business as usual.
Okay.
But I think that's, it would be impossible to not start preparing for some of these alternate scenarios.
Since we recorded that conversation, the picture for US wind has shifted again, and not always in the direction that developers hope for. A handful of delayed projects have restarted construction, including major offshore sites in New York, and a couple of states have doubled down on long-term procurement targets in an effort to stabilize demand. Yet the industry is cautious, and supply chain pressure, that old foreign entity of concern thing that isn't going away anytime soon, and the tight 2028 tax credit window are all forcing developers to rethink their timelines and their portfolios. So if the first half of the year felt like a roller coaster, it'll be the next 6 months that tell us whether the sector can regain momentum or whether we should brace for a more prolonged slowdown. That's it for now. I'm looking forward to bringing you all the developments over the next few months, and Sylvia will be back hosting around the middle of next year. But until then, I'll be here with you, speaking to industry leaders and investors in clean energy. So if there are ever any particular subjects that you would like us to investigate, you can always connect with us on LinkedIn or on X or Blue Sky. We are at Interchange Show. Thank you again for joining in. I'm Bridget Van Dorsten, and it's been great being with you. I look forward to bringing you more insights coming into the new year. In the meantime, feel free to follow the show wherever you're listening to it now, such that you don't miss our upcoming episodes. But until then, goodbye.